Well, hi everyone. Today I'm excited to have Stephan Bugaj, who is really multifaceted and has many career paths kind of going on. He's a co-author of Creative Writing Career 2 book, and he's also a co-host for the Creative Writing Career podcast, along with Justin Sloan and Kevin Tumlinson. He's also working as a VP of Creative for Handsome Robotics, creating personalities and stories for real humanoid robots, and the live events, films, and TV projects that they star in. Stefan is also a writer-filmmaker who most recently worked at Telltale Games as creative development director, helping to develop narrative and visual storytelling for Walking Dead Season 2, The Wolf Among Us, Game of Thrones, Tales from the Borderlands, and many more. And before that, he had 12 years experience at Pixar Animation Studios, working in various roles from concept development through post-production. And he's also written. He's had specs for Welcome to Akron. Did I say that right, Stefan?
That's right. Yep.
A military horror story placed in the Nickel Fellowship competition, and Let the Games Begin, which was featured at the Austin Film Festival. And so this is just, we could go on and on, but you've obviously had a lot of experience with, really it comes down to telling a good story, doesn't it?
It does.
In the end, all the experience really comes down to telling a good story. I don't know. It seems like the more experience you have, the better stories that come out, because you've just, been involved in so many different things. So.
That's true. Yeah, I have. And it definitely does all come down to telling a good story and giving the audience a good experience. So even in game development, where like Telltale was very, very story driven, but other games that I've worked on have been like less story driven. But even then, you're trying to give the audience the most satisfying experience. And I look at good gameplay like allowing the audience to craft a little narrative in which they're kicking ass and running away from monsters and that sort of thing. And there's a lot of like technical game design elements that go into making a game that's fun to play, but I also think that for me it's more fun to play if every moment feels like it's contributing to a story that you're telling. And obviously on the film and TV and comics and so on side, it's all about storytelling. And even at Pixar, when I was working not as a writer, when I was a filmmaker doing visuals and so on, we always thought about the story and thought about how what we were doing contributed to the story. What is this location that we're building mean, and how can we have it have a little bit of backstory based on the way that we paint it and the graphics that we put on it and so on, and what does it mean about its prior life and so on. So really, like, I've learned to look at the story contributions of every element that goes on the screen and goes into the soundtrack for many years across many disciplines.
Yes. Well, and it's just, that is so fascinating. Wow. Can we just kind of go back to just, from the beginning, a few years? Would you share your story? Like, what inspired you to be, want to write, to want to tell stories, to be a tech guy, a filmmaker, and all the many things you do? What was the inspiration?
Sure. I guess so. I kind of never really looked at it as wanting to write or be a tech guy. When I was young, I discovered that you could make things if you had pencils or a computer or a typewriter or a camera, and that just seemed very exciting. So I just did it. And my inspirations are very cliche for someone my age. Star Wars and Star Trek and Blade Runner and so
Yeah.
on and so forth. And all of the video games that I played, especially on the story side, the old Infocom games, which were super influential to me, Mind Forever Voyaging and the Zork series and et cetera. I played every single Infocom game, Hitchhiker's Guide, everything that came out. Richard Garriott's Ultima series was a huge influence on me as well in terms of game creation and style of games and so on. And of course, later on, first-person shooters, Doom and Castle Wolfenstein and so on. And also, books were a big influence on me as well. Like I read every pulp sci-fi I could get my hands on as a kid, whether it was, not so good stuff like Pierce Anthony, who's everything I read, all the way to
Yeah.
the great stuff like Philip K. Dick that I'm still reading today. So just kind of I always liked stories. I've always watched movies and TV and books and video games and tabletop games. I mean, Dungeons and Dragons is probably one of the most prevalent influences in my writing and storytelling, even though I don't usually write fantasy. Like high fantasy, you know, Tolkien, D&D, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser kind of stuff is not generally what I write, but the way of thinking that comes from being a tabletop gamer definitely pervades like the way I build worlds and the way that I tend to blow things out very wide and have multiple characters and then focus it back down. That all comes from years of tabletop gaming. So.
So you started working at Pixar Animation Studios in 2004, and you co-developed, feature projects, and you worked on projects like Brave, Wall-E, and The Incredibles, which our kids all love, by the way. I love them too. I love animations. I mean, they're just amazing. So would you talk about the process of, just the process that you were involved in? Like, I'm not sure if you were part of, writing the stories with the animation or, but you were involved in the whole process of development. Would you just talk about that?
Sure. I mean, I did a bunch of different things at Pixar. It was towards the end of my time there that I was involved in story development.
Okay.
I worked with Mark Andrews and Brian Larson on developing a couple of features in development, one of which went all the way through script, but both of them ended up getting canceled ultimately. But before that, on the features that got released that I'm credited on, I did a variety of different things. Visual work on some of them, surfacing, compositing, simulation of clothing and procedural effects. I basically worked on, like, because in shorts I did a whole bunch of different stuff. So I've worked on almost every stage of the animation pipeline, like hands-on.
Yeah.
Except for character animation. I didn't do any character animation at Pixar, but pretty much every other stage of the pipeline I did some work in, from the beginning to the end, including finaling. And so the process of making an animated film, basically you start with a pitch of an idea, you get that approved, you develop a treatment, you get that approved, you develop a screenplay, you get that approved. While that's going on, you've got storyboard artists under the head of story who are doing mood boards and then beat boards and then storyboards. So once the first script is approved, then they're starting to blow out those mood boards and beat boards into full storyboards to put an animatic reel together, which an editor comes in and cuts an animatic reel with scratch voices and scratch music. And it's like an entire cut of the movie. And that gets screened. And that process iterates for forever for the rest of the movie.
Yeah.
There's continuing updates of the script and updates of the cut. But once sequences start getting approved from coming out of this reel screenings, they start going into the CG pipeline in the case of a Pixar movie, or the hand-drawn pipeline in the case of a hand-drawn movie. The CG pipeline, the way that looks is you've got layout artists who are setting up camera with rough blocking objects, then set dressers who are dressing in more refined objects, while the set modelers are building the finals that then get dressed in. You've got layout is also blocking in paths of characters, and then animation goes in and does rough real blocking. And then you've got like lighting that comes in. Mm-hmm. You've got visual effects that come in, simulation of cloth and hair, etc. But basically, layout and animation are building the visual story, and the whole rest of the pipeline is refining the visual story with the surfaces of the models and the way that it's lit and the effects that happen and the cloth that moves and the hair that moves and so on. And that gets iterated as just like the story. You show it to the director, you get notes, you iterate on that, show it to the director, you get notes. That pushes through, and then rendering and compositing take everything that everyone else has done. They render it. They do any compositing tweaks that need to be done, and then that goes to the director. And when a shot is final, that goes to the film out department. And when a reel is final, that gets completely set up for film out with Deluxe or Technicolor or Photocam or whoever's going to do it. And that process just iterates until essentially the executives say, all right, we're not giving you any more money, time to release the film, and then the film comes out.
Oh, that's great. That's fascinating to to hear about how that process actually works. Most of us just see the actual animation, right? We don't understand all that goes that's involved in that. That's a lot of work, right?
It is a huge, complicated, continuously operating process that runs for, depending on the scale of the animation production, usually anywhere from 3 to 5 years of like a slow startup, a huge ramp up in the middle, a big push, and then a ramp down at the end. And you've got all of these pieces moving along and all of these iterations going on. And, layout, animation, and lighting are doing the major visual storytelling components, and then everyone else is making that look amazing. And that takes a lot of people a long time, and then you get to enjoy it.
Yeah, absolutely. So where does the storyboard come in with the writers? Like, I'm just not sure so the writers write the story first, and then the artists come in.
It varies. It varies, and it's also fairly interconnected, and it depends on the studio, how things start, and so on. Traditionally, a lot of animation kind of didn't necessarily have writers, at least not early in the process. Animators would just create something.
Okay.
Starting with storyboards. In the big studios that are making tens of millions of dollars animated features, it tends to more often start at least with a written treatment so that the structure is there, but often a script as well. TV still sometimes does entirely boarded shows with not a lot of upfront writing, although a lot of the animated TV production is starting to do traditional scripts up front, really just to save iteration time, because it's cheaper to pay one or a couple of writers to keep banging on things as opposed to a half dozen storyboard artists. And so the way it works is you've got your director, you've got your head of story, which is what the lead storyboard artist is called at Pixar. You've got your writer. And then you've got a production designer. And the production designer is working with concept artists and doing concept art themselves as concept one-offs. They're creating characters and sets and so on as visual styles. And they're iterating on what the style is going to be like with the director. So that's like really what the production design department is doing. The story department is working with the director and the writer or the writer's output to set up the shots, basically, to set up the sequences initially, and then the shots, and like not frame by frame, because then they'd be animating it, but they're drawing basically what the visual storytelling looks like in terms of framing and movement on the screen, and how that translates the written word or a director's verbal pitch into visual storytelling. Yeah. So they're providing a framework for the entire visual storytelling pipeline. And then a writer may be writing an entire screenplay in advance, which is how it usually works at Pixar now. Write a treatment, write a screenplay. The head of story will be doing mood boards and beat boards while that's going on, and maybe even starting to draw some sequences if they've got favorites and so on. But it's not until the script is approved to go into reels that you get all of your board artists on the team assigned to then go and draw the entire film and have an editor assigned to cut it into a reel. And then that process, once it's rolling, iterates. Sometimes animation writers on a very animator-driven project will come in, everything will have been boarded already, and they'll just be writing dialogue.
Oh,
And
okay.
that's less common than it used to be. I hear it used to be more common back before I was in the industry. But some projects may still be done that way. But really, it's a collaboration between the director, the head of story, and the writer in terms of crafting the overall story, and then the concept designers working for the production designer and the art director are creating the visual style with the director, and that's kind of the big overarching how like the whole overall story and look are created. The editor comes on very early in an animated film, at least in a Pixar, Disney, Blue Sky, DreamWorks style pipeline,
Yeah.
where they're cutting these boards into reels. And, in live action, an editor comes on at the end and finishes the movie. In animation, an editor comes on before almost anyone else. Like, they're coming on only after, like, the producer, writer, head of story, director, maybe the production designer and art director, and the board artist who drew the stuff that they're going to be cutting. So they're like the 10th or 12th person on the film, as opposed to almost the last in live action. And so an editor has a big contribution to the continuing story development in animation that they don't necessarily have in live action, although they have a huge impact
Yeah.
on live action films. What they have to work with and the time that they get to work with it is very different. And that's kind of the overall of how a animated story is crafted. So.
Oh, that's so fascinating. What sort of tips would you have for writers who are, say, they're currently novelists or screenwriters, but who would like to write for animation feature films? Do you have some tips for writers that are interested in that?
Learn to draw.
That's good.
Well, I mean, so animation is a very small section of the industry. And I got into animation by being in animation.
Okay.
Like 12 years at Pixar made a big difference.
Yes.
And so someone who's, say, a novelist or a spec screenwriter who's interested in writing for animation. So to write for the big guys, you have to have experience already.
Yeah.
It helps to know about animation, although a lot of the big studios now are hiring experienced live action writers to write on animated films.
Okay.
People who've done Sundance Darling films or big Marvel films or stuff like that, kind of either end of the spectrum, but who've shown talent for the craft and some degree of whimsy and humor in their own work. And as far as writing animation specs go, it used to be that it was the dumbest idea in the world because animation was completely controlled by a half dozen big studios who did 100% of development internally, and animation specs were worthless. That is starting to change because of a lot of smaller companies trying to get into the low-end animation market who weren't in previous decades. So you've kind of got a comeback of people kind of in the vein of like Hanna-Barbera and the Kroft brothers and so on, who are trying to do cheaper animation, and those companies are more willing to look at specs if they're a company that was started by producers who don't necessarily write and aren't necessarily animators. They're looking more at anyone who can bring something in. Companies that are started by writers and animators, obviously there's going to be less of an opportunity, and it's going to be more of who you know and expanding your personal network to include animation people. So I wouldn't, like, if someone really, really, really wants to get into animation very badly, probably television animation has the most opportunity because there's just more of it being made. And then perhaps building into an animation feature career that way by doing that and writing some specs and going to smaller companies. But it's great. Animation is awesome. Like, there's a lot of super fun stuff you can do with animation, but people have to keep in mind that it's a small subsection of an already small industry. So like all of the things that you hear about how Hollywood is hard to break into and requires a lot of diligence and patience and hard work, it's more true of animation just because it's a smaller industry.
Well, that's good. That gives a really good glimpse into, so I mean, you just got to be, persistent and really wanting to go after it, right? Yeah,
Totally.
basically.
Yeah, for sure. And it doesn't hurt to do something like, go on the boards, CG Talk and, AWN boards and stuff. And if you find people who are trying to put a project together, working on a small project, it may very well fall apart. Most independent everythings fall apart because it's hard to get the money and hard to keep them together.
Yeah.
But you'll be learning something along the way. And if you have the time to expend on something like that, you can meet interesting people who may want to work with you later on. You might even get a project finished. You'll learn some stuff. I think that there's a increasing expectation that people will have pursued things more on their own throughout all of the entertainment industry.
Yeah.
You want to make games, try and make an indie game. You want to make animation, try and make indie animation. You want to make movies, try and make an indie movie. And the tools are cheaper now, and there's more forums to meet people. It's just a matter of putting in the time and the talent, and that doesn't mean it's easy. It's hard.
Yeah.
Most of those projects fail, but it's a thing that can be done.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's really good. Well, let's transition into another form of storytelling with video games. Yeah.
Yeah, that was what I was doing at Telltale Games.
Yeah.
And Telltale makes very story-based video games. They're kind of like playable TV shows.
Yeah.
And it's mostly about character interactions, how characters respond to your choices. People get very into whether or not character A or B likes them or hates them, whether or not their choice got someone killed in Walking Dead, and that sort of thing. And with the Telltale game, the gameplay is fairly secondary. And so, to some people, that's a mark against them. I think it's a mark in its favor because I really want to play the story and not test my skill at moving a mouse. And so that was very appealing to me, and that's why I went to work there. And now I do transmedia. Like, I work across multiple media. I'm doing games, I'm doing VR, I'm doing films, I'm doing television, I'm doing robotics, I'm doing audio storytelling. Like, whatever is out there, I am trying to tell stories on that platform because I think that the different forms of storytelling through different technologies is interesting, and I like exploring the different forms. And I also like working with sound and imagery as much as with words, and so I like working in media that have more than just words on a page. So I kind of try and do everything I can across all the media.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. Well, like with like I have two sons who are totally into gaming, but there's different types of like I guess, would you call it stories in games? Like Minecraft, that's isn't that kind of like a world building?
Yeah.
Where you build your own world. So it's more like the game player has more space to do what they want.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah, there's definitely different styles of games, and most games would say that they don't have much storytelling going on. Like, a lot of game developers will say, oh, story is very secondary, it's kind of a layer of gloss over the gameplay, or it's not important. And there are certainly a lot of games that kind of feel that way, but I personally think that players are creating a story in their head all the time, and the world that you give them that allows them to do that is important. The characters you give them that allow them to do that are important. Like, I look at a game like Valve's Team Fortress. Team Fortress literally has no story at all. There is absolutely no like cutscenes or voiceover saying like, in a world, or welcome commander, your mission is blah blah. Like, Team Fortress is just go shoot each other. Like, that's all that the gameplay is, and it's a super fun game. But one of the things that I think made it so successful was they created these silly characters that you play, and they are all characters. They have distinct personalities, and they went and made these little videos that give you their backstories and show them being funny and doing ridiculous things, and they were super popular and successful. But even before they did those videos, They just created these funny voices for these funny characters and gave them these interactions and these little setup scenes that just made him a character. And so people had stories that they were creating with that character in their head while they were playing. And Pac-Man did the same thing super simply with the interstitial scenes that had like Pac-Man chasing the various different ghosts across and like one line of text telling you like the story of Pac-Man, which was ridiculous and pointless. Yet then there's Pac-Man Cartoons, and it's like maybe the biggest franchise of all time in gaming. I think it still is. It was for a while, and so on and so forth. And gameplay is the most important thing in gaming. That is absolutely true. But I think if you don't create interesting characters, interesting worlds, and some kind of story framework, at least, that players will, it won't be, as they say, sticky. Like you look at like the gem games and some of the simpler in terms of story framework, like Match 3 games. Like people will play them, or Scrabble or that sort of thing, Worlds with Friends. People will play those like, you know, the same way they play cards or do the crossword puzzle.
Yeah.
No one wants to see like the crossword puzzle, the movie, right? No one wants the crossword puzzle comic book series, like, you know, poker, the novel. Like people like that's not what you get out of those. And with games, it's the same way. If you just create a really awesome game with awesome gameplay, it's not going to become a franchise. Whereas if you just do some work on character development and creating a framework, players will create these stories in their heads. And then when you say, hey, do you want a Sonic the Hedgehog movie? Do you want a Mario Brothers movie? Do you want a Halo graphic novel series? People will be like, why, yes, I do.
Yeah.
As opposed to, you know, do you want a whatever Gemstone Falls movie? Like, no, not really. Like, what would that be about, right? So.
Oh, that's funny. That's true. When you put it that way, of course. Yes, I'm just curious. How do all these threads, you know, to make it fun for the game player? How do you put all these threads in there? I guess.
Totally. There's certainly different schools of thought about how one puts together a great role-playing game, which have led to actual fistfights. I have seen some of my more wily game designer friends in our youth get into actual fistfights over balance and how that would be approached and so on. You've got your school of thought that is very rules and mechanics based, and that it's very much like a war game, and everything should be subject to the whims of the tables and the dice. And it's very much about crafting a party with the appropriate skills and equipment to make it through that machinery. There is the infamous punish your players school of thought, which led to an infamous Gary Gygax dungeon that has had many years of arguing about it that people can look up on the forums. And then there's the school of thought that I always belong to, that the best GMs that I played with belong to. And when we crafted our adventures, whether for electronic games or tabletop games, looked at it more as getting the players to involve themselves in a story that was unfolding in that dungeon or land or whatever it may be. And yes, you have the tests of skill and you have the dice rolls and whatever, but in creating it, you're trying to get them to go through an adventure. And an adventure is a story that involves characters facing peril and a response from each character that is characteristic of who that person is to the peril, and how do they get through it. And that's what's interesting about adventure stories. And in adventure gaming, you want to have interesting characters and interesting peril. You know, for electronic gaming, a lot of adventures err a little more on the mechanics and loot side, right? Like we're going through to beat up Balrogs and take their gold or whatever. And I think the best electronic games still bring in interesting opponent personalities, interesting sidekick personalities, interesting quest giver personalities, story frameworks and backgrounds. In tabletop gaming, of course, you can cheat to your heart's content because there's no arbiter of the rules. And the best adventures I've ever had were with my college friend and game master, Sylvan Klebsch, who his undergraduate thesis was designing a gaming system. And even though he was designing a system, like, it was all about creating a great adventure and a great story. And dice rolls were hints as to how things would go, and it was more about the story and your attitude. And a great GM really is like a play director or a conductor bringing people together to create this creative work of storytelling and narrative centered around this rule system and set in this particular setting, but you, the players, are all actors in this drama, and a great GM is like a stage director getting you to craft a great story around this setup.
There is a lot involved, hey, with writing a great game, really.
Oh, for sure, for sure.
Wow, that's really neat. So there are like, if people, now that they're listening to you describe gaming, I mean, gaming is so fun, but sometimes we aren't sure of all the details it would are involved in actually writing a good one. Who decides how the story's actually going to go in the end? Like, there's a bunch of ideas, right? But
right.
Someone's got to decide, right?
Yeah, games are very, very much not driven by writers 90% of the time.
Okay.
It's way more like animation used to be. I mean, animation is still driven by animators and animation directors, and writers and editors have more of a role than they used to, but it's still very much driven by that side of the house. In gaming, it's very much driven by programmers and game designers. And you have a role called the creative director, who often is someone who knows something about design and visual design and voice directing and writing, who kind of brings it all together. And on a big AAA game, you'll have a lead writer and probably some other writers who are writing segments of story in different levels, and junior writers who are writing barks and text for when you look at things and it tells you what it is, and so on. So there may be a writing team, but usually a game starts with a concept, which can be written, but it's still a concept and usually comes from the creative director or the lead programmer or the lead game designer. And then a team is put together that may include a writer to put together the story, but the story is always sublimated to the level design and the gameplay and so on. And there's a lot of tension about that in terms of great gameplay versus great story, and a great team can figure it all out and put out an amazing game like, say, BioShock.
Yeah.
And a team that is maybe not firing all cylinders will put out a game that looks amazing, but the story is clunky, or has an interesting story, but the gameplay isn't so great. That happens as well, but that's the balance that you're trying to find. And it involves a team working together, but it's not writer-led. It's designer-led and programmer-led and really creative director-led, but often they come from those other. Some creative directors come from writing. I did.
Yeah.
I mean, I've done game design. I actually did professional game design before I did professional writing, but I'm more known as a writer. So that's how the process usually works. On like a little shooter game or a platformer or something, there's probably no writer at all.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe they brought in a friend who is a writer, or hired someone to be like, why is this guy jumping on platforms? Here's money for a day. Write down why this guy's jumping around on platforms and who he is. Thanks.
Yeah.
But I mean, you need that. Like, I think it's important. Not everyone does, but I do. I think those are the games that really click. But on a story-driven game, like a Telltale game or a deeper adventure game, then you have a writer and a designer working together very, very closely, like paired as a team, to figure out the interplay of the game and the story very deeply. And of course, in Telltale, it's super close pairing, because what you're playing is the story. Like, you're making the thing that's most interesting to players is making decisions about relationships and branches, and that's crucial to how the story holds together. So the designer and the writer literally are paired up and are in most meetings together, and they spend lots of time together, ideally, if they're working well together, to craft that as a team where the mechanics and gameplay and pacing and flow of how a player wants to play matches the flow and pacing and reveals and so on of how the story needs to be told. I mean, writing games is hard for a lot of writers because it really is the designer's show, and you need to be willing to support that and make some compromises to allow the game to be great and still figure out ways to allow the story to be great. And it's hard. And at the same time, in, let's say, film, if you're the writer, all of the grief that writers, are known for taking in film, and you can go read Goldman's books and whoever else's books about that. At the end of the day, who do people talk about? The director, the star, and then the writer. Yeah. In gaming, it's like not that many people even know that a lot of games have writers. Like there are not a huge number of well-known game writers. There are not a lot of games where people know that writers were involved. It's really the designer's show, and it's like the designer, the creative director, the lead programmer, the voice talent. Like you're kind of getting pushed further back in terms of like fortune and glory, as Indiana Jones might say. And so you really have to love the medium and want to tell stories in that way, because it's way more teamwork.
Yeah.
Very much teamwork. Animation is a lot more teamwork than a lot of live action writers can tolerate as well. And certainly novelists. Novelists historically have had a hard time coming over into filmmaking and now game making because they're used to sitting alone in a room for 8 months, sucking down coffee and eating Cheetos and banging out words. And all of a sudden in film or especially like in animation and games, like you're in an office with lots of people and they keep coming to bother you about things constantly and wanting you to make changes and telling you what's going on and like look at these boards and look at this character design and so on. And it's not like your Hermitage. And so it's challenging for people to come into animation and gaming if they've not been accustomed to working collaboratively, like really collaboratively. Like even live action writers, you start by writing specs and kind of throwing them over a wall. And so when you actually get to the like having to do rewrites on sets part, not everyone survives that process. And animation is that process every day for 3 to 8 years.
So you have to be really okay with that, right?
Yeah. And gaming's the same way. It's that process every day for however long. In both cases, if you have a career, it's that every day forever. So you have to be okay with that.
You have to be okay with that. No, that's really good. This is really helpful. So would you? I know this wasn't one of the questions, but would you talk about those other things that you are involved in? I was just I read that you have done voice acting and audio production, and that you were the voice of Mr. Incredible.
I was the voice of Mr. Incredible in the Easter egg production that is on the DVD of The Incredibles.
Okay.
Called The Incredible Socks.
Okay.
Awesome. And if you find that Easter egg, it's the entire Incredibles told with sock puppets in a very short period of time.
Yeah.
Which is a cut down from the original epic 15-minute version that we shot. And that came from the producer and director of The Incredibles were going on a retreat or something. They were going to be out of the studio for a couple of days. And this guy, Mock Kobayashi, a friend of mine, made a smart-ass comment in the meeting. And John Walker, the producer, was like, all right, Mock's going to finish the movie while we're out, and then we'll be done. And Mock came to some of his friends, and we were like, let's finish the movie while they're out, and then we'll be done. So we had the script, so we shot the entire script in abridged format with sock puppets.
Yeah.
And and they thought it was hilarious. So it ended up being an Easter egg on the DVD.
Oh, awesome! Isn't that fun? So you just never know. You just yeah.
Yep.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. Yeah, and my other voice acting credits are from video games. Back in the day, when I worked as a contractor at Strategic Simulations, doing some audio software stuff, I was in the booth logging sessions for voice acting and Foley, and they were like, would you like to voice some things and make some Foley? That will save us money. And everyone on the audio crew basically did some. So we all did some voices and some Foley for the games that we worked on.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, that sounds like just a ton of fun, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And
honestly, it was so long ago, people were like, oh, you were in Silent Hunter and Thunderscape. Who were you? I'm like, I don't know. Like, probably someone who, I probably said, like, one line somewhere in the game, like, I know, Captain Torpedoes, or, like, quick, your sword. Like, I have no idea. Like, it was so long ago, I literally am like, I have no idea.
But, that's just a lot of fun to, work on these different things. You are a writer, too. Have you worked on some fiction, then, that, like novels, or do you... I know you worked on, co-wrote that book, creative writing career, right?
So, yeah, I mean, the type of writing that I do is mostly writing for other media. So, game fiction writing, screenplays, like the stuff I write at Pixar and the specs, the game stories, the closest to like a novel that I'm about to have is there's a new platform called Bound, getbound.io, and they will be releasing later this summer, and it's for mobile devices, and it is serialized short fiction, so kind of like the old pulps back at the turn of the last century.
Oh, love it. That's awesome.
So it's serialized short fiction with some illustration. And so not graphic novels, but just illustrations that go along with the prose. And then the prose is also going to be read by a voice actor, audiobook style. And so it's an awesome new platform that I really like. I love the idea behind it. And so you'll have like my short prose and the other author's short prose. You'll have some illustrations to go with it, and it'll be read aloud. And it's broken down into short chunks, so that you've got, like a comic book or the old pulps, you've got a series that will be one story, and it's broken down into small segments that build into that story. So the idea being that you can read and or listen and look on the bus to work, or while you're walking to school, or whatever it may be. And I think it's a great idea. But that's so that's like closer to magazine prose, basically. It's not a novel.
Oh, okay. But that sounds fascinating. I could see that. I could see people catching on to that. You're just walking to the bus, and you just want something short to listen to, right?
Yep.
That's interesting, and I could totally see that. I'd do that.
Yeah, and you can listen, read, and there's the imagery to look at. So it's great for commuting, on the line at the grocery store, before you go to bed, that kind of thing. And it really is, like, it's something that I had wanted to do myself. And when they told me they were building it, I was like, great, you've saved me 5 years of my life. And I will release on your platform. Because I had thought that bringing back the old illustrated pulps to today's technology had always been a good idea. And I think it's a great idea, and I'm very excited that that one of my stories is going to be one of the first things to come out on that platform.
Oh, that's great. Wow. That's exciting. Well, thanks so much, Stephan. This has been so great. I mean, you're just a fount of knowledge. I didn't even know how many, there's so many questions I wanted to ask you. I was trying to narrow it down because you just know so much about so many different areas, right, of storytelling. It's just fascinating to talk to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been fun to be on.
Oh, yes. Well, before you go, would you just share, if there's any other new projects you're working on right now, and then where people can find you online?
Sure. There's always new projects that I'm working on.
Yeah.
So probably the best way to find out when I can talk about things is to follow me on Twitter, which is at Stephan Bugaj. And my website, www.bugaj.com, has a blog that I am very lazy about updating, but it also has the links to my Twitter and my Facebook and God knows what else. It's Twitter and Facebook are active. The other ones are obligatory. I don't know even what some of those icons are. So I tend to post like announcements about what my new projects are on Twitter and Facebook and the blog. So
yeah, no, that's really good. Well, Stephan, this has been awesome. Thanks so
Thank
much
you.
for taking the
Thank
time
you.
to chat.
Thanks for having me.